But for 30 years, their process of reform of our financial sector has resulted in more than half of all companies delisting.
Why are some companies delisting from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange? What explains the small number of IPOs on the JSE? I posed this question to Paul Miller, a mining finance professional, in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to watch the full discussion with Paul Miller, that's linked in the description below. Enjoy. All right, Paul, and you mentioned South Africa's capital markets, and you've been writing publicly. There's a piece in the Daily Maverick, how to rescue South Africa's broken capital markets. And we'll link to that in the show notes. And I think South Africa, unlike many other African countries, got fairly liquid capital markets, able to raise financing locally. But we are seeing a delisting wave, many companies going off of the JSE and going private. What's driving that, and how does that connect with our earlier discussion around the state of mining investment more broadly?
Exactly as we've been sleepwalking into the sunset of our mining industry, we have been sleepwalking into the sunset of our public capital markets too. And it's taken me a long time to kind of work it out. But what it is that in short, provided enormous numbers of tax incentives to individual savers, but we've allowed institutions to be the gatekeeper and to collectively monopolize access to those tax incentives, which means that all our funding largely is now through institutions, and they all have a size and liquidity constraint. So they will only invest in depends who you ask, either the top 80, the top 100, or the top 140 companies. But basically, the 11 institutions that manage 90%, if you include the PIC, 90% of all our funds under management in South Africa invest only in the top 100, 140 companies on the stock exchange. And what increasingly has happened in the last decade is all our retail investors with the stockbrokers have been moved into those same institutional funds or into model portfolios that mimic those institutional funds. And it's no fault of the small companies. Simply because they are small, they cannot attract investor interest. And exploration companies always start small. So there is no space in our public markets for exploration, unlike Canada and Australia. And then the question is asked, well, what do? Well, they provide tax incentives for retail investors to invest directly in smaller companies. And we have no discussion of that here. National Treasury is completely blind to the problem. And it's taken I've had to write a lot of stuff before even the people at the JSE, et cetera, are starting to recognize that it doesn't matter what their rules are or how expensive or cheap it is to list on the JSE. The JSE is just the market square. You can make it as pretty as you like. But if all the investors are wholesalers, they're not going to buy small quantities of product. And that's effectively my point about our public market. So if you want a lively, dynamic, effective exploration scene in your country, and we've got the geology to support that, you do need good administration. It's a basic requirement. We don't have that. Good regulation and administration. You need good pre-competitive data, and the Council for Geoscience understands that and is starting to produce more pre-competitive. This is the base science that's required. But the access to finance means that you actually have to be able to, the flip side of developing the exploration market is also doing public market development, right? You need to say, well, actually, it's a good thing to have retail investors. It's a good thing for people to take a punt on a stock. It's not bad that people, get involved. Think about this. The JSE has 450,000 individual investors. One cryptocurrency online exchange has 5 times as many in South Africa alone. I think we've got, people are happy to invest online and trade. They're just not happy to invest online and trade on the JSE. And that's something we need to address.
And how would you suggest addressing it?
You've got to firstly acknowledge that a diversity of smaller investors is good for the public market. Okay, if you think it's bad for the public market, as I think the FSCA thinks it is, they don't want, it's very nanny state-ish. They don't want individuals to take any risk with their retirement savings, for example. But the problem with that is that if you force all individuals to invest through institutions, the institutions only go for the large and the liquid. So you've got to acknowledge that it's good for public markets to have a diversity of smaller investors, and then you've got to provide incentives, as the Australians, as the British, as the Canadians do, for people to put their own money into the stock exchange. And that's tax incentives. So you've got to provide incentives for people to invest in the smaller end of the stock exchange. And they do it in the UK, they do it in Canada, they do it in Australia. In South Africa, our regulators want everyone to give their money to an institution. Problem is the institution doesn't invest in the smaller end of the stock exchange.
So Paul, I mean, I think what's characterized our conversation is this theme that often policies are intended to do one thing, but actually have all sorts of unintended effects. And you've mentioned incentives quite a lot in the discussion. And, you know, when I see incentives, I often see an implicit subsidy for a particular kind of outcome. And, you know, trying to maybe design things in a particular way. And perhaps there's a risk that you have more unintended consequences. You know, so what are some of the second order effects of incentives? I mean, I know you mentioned other markets, but
I mean, you're right.
What about here?
Okay. You're absolutely right. And we've seen National Treasury withdraw from having targeted tax incentives for different industries because people are clever. And the expensive lawyers are hired by the private sector and they find a way, right? We saw that with the 12J industry. So you're absolutely correct. But there is one difference, is that we are not the test bed. The incentives I'm talking about work successfully in other markets. Other countries have tested them for decades. So I'm not suggesting we try and invent something new. And you always have to be wary of incentives having those second order effects. And it's true. And we see now, National Treasury has now said, withdrawn all tax incentives, we're going to try and drop the overall corporate tax rate, right? That's fine. But for 30 years, their process of reform of our financial sector has resulted in more than half of all companies delisting. Now, that's an unintended effect too, right? When the Jacobs Committee report was published in 1992, which is the report that forms the basis for all our capital markets reform that have come subsequently, they said that this flow of funds, the flow of contractual savings into institutions and therefore into the equity markets would lead to a flourishing of rights issues and new companies listing. What's actually happened, unintended, the exact opposite. We've more than halved the number of listed companies on our stock exchange. So I'm fully alive to this idea that incentives can have the wrong effect. And in fact, I would put it to you that the incentives that we've given for investors to save, where we've made the institutions the gatekeepers, has resulted in a second order effect of far fewer listed companies, even though the total amount of savings has increased. That's not what they expected. It's not what the members of the Jacobs Committee, they predicted the opposite. So now here we are sitting 30 years later with an unintended effect of an incentive. But as I said, the advantage we have is we can look at how flow-through shares or exploration company tax credits work in Canada and Australia. We can look at how the AIM market has over 1,000 companies listed on it in the UK, whereas our Altex only has 21.
Thanks for watching. Why are firms delisting from the JSE? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Also, if you would like to watch the full discussion with Paul Miller, that's linked over here. You can also subscribe to my other channel, that's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.